Okay, hello everyone. I'm Chelsea Lake. I'm a member of the events team at Politics and Prose Bookstore, and I'd like to welcome you to PNP Live. We would like to thank our friends at the Washington Literacy Center for co-sponsoring this event. Washington Literacy Center has been helping DC residents with the greatest barriers and fewest resources learn to read since 1963. And we're so glad to have them as our partners. I will be dropping a link in the chat where you can learn more about the organization and also make a donation if you are able. Before we get started, a few housekeeping notes. At any point during the event, you can click on the link that I'll be putting in the chat to purchase Murder at the Mission on the Politics and Prose website. You can ask a question by clicking on the Q&A feature, which is located at the bottom of your screen. We'll try to get to everyone's questions, but I apologize in advance if we don't have time to address yours. We are delighted to offer closed captioning for this event via Zoom's auto captioning service. To access captions, just click on the live transcript option at the bottom of your screen. Finally, thank you again for being with us here tonight. And it's now my pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers. Blaine Harden is a contributor of The Economist, PBS Frontline, and Foreign Policy, and has formerly served as the Washington Post's bureau chief in East Asia and Africa. He is the author of The Great Leader and the Fighter Pilot, Escape from Camp 14, an international bestseller published in 27 languages, A River Lost, and Africa, Dispatches from a Fragile Continent, which won a PEN American Center citation for a first book of nonfiction. Harden will be in conversation with David Maraniss, a New York Times bestselling author, fellow of the Society of American Historians, and visiting distinguished professor at Vanderbilt University. He's currently working on a biography of Jim Thorpe. Please join me in welcoming them to PNP Live. Gentlemen.
Thank you, Chelsea. Hello, Blaine.
Hi, David. It's great to be with you.
You too. This is a serious and important book, but I have to tell all the virtual listeners and watchers that this is a joy for me. Blaine and I are old and dear friends. We've worked together and known each other for, I think, 45 years.
Yeah.
So incredible.
So it's so relaxing to talk to you.
Blaine, it sort of seems to me that Murder at the Mission is kind of the product or culmination of all of your previous books in different ways. It has the clarity and illumination of your book on Africa, the sort of honest ferocity of your books on North Korea. And then it continues the search for understanding of your own home territory that you began with your book on the Columbia River. It's kind of an intricate story in a sense with a large cast of characters. But at its basic, it's very simple. It's sort of a story of a hoary myth created and propagated by the dominant Protestant white society at the expense of indigenous people, Native Americans. So let's start with where your book does, with the myth in its simplest form, which involves you. You as a child, unwittingly in elementary school, sort of with performing in a play. What was that play and what was its meaning for young people and for the Northwest?
Well, I was in elementary school and, I have been searching to try to remember it with real clarity, but you don't remember things with real clarity when you're in elementary school. But basically what I learned was that Indians were bad and that missionaries were good. And the framework for this morality tale was that a couple of white Protestant missionaries had come to the Oregon country, which was Washington and Oregon and Idaho, basically, in the 1830s. And they had done their best to try to make the local Cayuse tribe near the present town of Walla Walla to turn them into Christians. And they taught them to read and they'd taught them to plow and they'd been very successful. But then after a time, the ungrateful Indians murdered them. But also,
and that was the play?
That was the play. Although our play, it didn't reenact the murder.
Oh, okay.
But we also learned that before Marcus Whitman, who was one of the missionaries who was murdered, Dr. Marcus Whitman, before he was murdered, he had rushed to Washington and somehow persuaded the president at the time that the British were scheming to steal the Pacific Northwest away from the United States and make it part of Britain. But he had thwarted that plot through his magical missionary powers. And then he came back and became a martyr, really, to manifest destiny, to making our country great. And that story is a story that they told me the story was true, and so I believed it. And I'm a baby boomer, and since I've written this book and been jabbering about it for a couple of years to other baby boomers, they learned the same thing in public schools in Washington and Oregon. It was just part of the stuff you learn in this part of the country. I think you could compare it to maybe what you learn if you grew up in the South. Maybe that the Civil War was a principled fight for states' rights. And it wasn't really about enslaving human beings. In any case, it was a few years ago that something about this myth just stuck in my head. And I needed a subject for another book. And so I went to the University of Washington Library and I went to work.
The Los Angeles Times did a really nice piece on you and your research for the book.
Yeah.
But it had this quote of the African proverb. I don't know if you heard it when you were in Africa, but I loved it.
It was a terrific
quote. The lions have their own historians. The hunt will always glorify the hunter.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, but let's go back to Marcus Whitman. I mean, the myth will come later. The ride to Washington, all the baloney about that, the murder. But who was he, and why did he go out west?
Well, he was part of a generation of missionaries that really flowered on the East Coast in the first 5 decades of the 1800s. And in the larger society, there was an incredible eruption of Christian faith. It was called the Second Great Awakening. And churchiness among Americans exploded. In the 1790s, a very low percentage of Americans went to church every week. By the 1840s, most Americans went to church. And in some places like the area of upstate New York, where Marcus Whitman and Narcissa Whitman were from, everybody went to church. And they believed in an evangelical version of a strict Calvinist Protestantism, and they wanted the whole world to believe as they did. So that was one big social movement that the missionaries were part of. But the second big part of it was that the United States government in Washington had been busy buying up the American West. The Louisiana Purchase, the acquisition of Texas and California, and then the Pacific Northwest was another big chunk of it. And so there were hundreds of millions of acres of land to be possessed by Americans on the East Coast. And so what happened in the 1830s and 1840s, which is the period of the Whitman experience, is that this evangelistic spirit got married to manifest destiny. So it became both godly and patriotic to go out west and take land. The missionaries who were sent out actually with a good goal. Their idea was to prepare native people for the coming of white hordes, so they learn Christianity, learn how to read, learn how to operate and survive in a white-dominated society. And
that's good goal, quote unquote.
Yeah, and that's why Marcus and Narcissa Whitman left New York and went to the Oregon country in 1836.
And they went to a territory, as you mentioned briefly, occupied by the Cayuse Indians.
Right.
Cayuse. I
Right,
learned
the
how to
Cayuse
pronounce it.
Indians.
And who are they?
Well, the Cayuse were a small but warlike tribe, never more than 2,000 or 3,000 individuals. But they were what I think should be called early adopters of white technology. In fact, they were really good at it. In the 1700s, they were the first to acquire horses from the Southwest. And they got lots of horses, and they used those horses it made them mobile warriors, highly mobile warriors. And so their influence, their economic power, their military power was wholly disproportional to their actual numbers. They were major players on the Columbia Plateau. And the area that we're talking about, the stage for this story, is the area where the huge Columbia River, this great river of the Northwest, it comes down and it turns to the west, and it now forms the border between Oregon and Washington. But the river is chock full of salmon in these areas. It was basically flowing with money because people caught those fish, they dried them, and they traded them. And those fish traded as far as California, Canada, and out into the plains. And they traded them for everything from guns to buffalo pelts to slaves to timber.
The Cayuse had slaves?
The Cayuse were middlemen, traders, warriors. They were hotshots. And the reason they wanted to have white missionaries come to their area is because they saw white missionaries and a white God as a possible supplement to their toolkit of Western acquired power, spiritual power and physical power. The separation between those was not really, I mean, they saw them as basically hand in hand. And they hoped that having these white people around with their teachings would make them more powerful. And so that's why they actually welcomed the Whitmans and gave them a very handsome plot of land to live on. And they stayed there from 1836 until 1847.
And things went sour, obviously.
Things went sour pretty quickly.
Yes.
Because as the Cayuse saw it, the white people didn't deliver anything that was worthwhile to them. The Whitmans were, as I said, strict Calvinist Protestants, and they wouldn't even baptize anybody unless they jumped through 1,000 complicated hoops of learning about the intricacies of Christianity, the resurrection of Jesus, all of this stuff, which is very hard, even for non-educated white people to understand. It just didn't work. I mean, they didn't buy it. They got nothing out of it. And pretty soon they started telling the Whitmans to leave, to get out. And they told them that for years. In fact, they periodically punched up Marcus Whitman, pulled his ears, threw off his hat, and told him to take his wife and go somewhere else. But the Whitmans were stubborn and they wouldn't leave.
You talked about Narcissa, his wife. What role did she play?
Well, Narcissa was critical for the fame of the Whitmans. She grew up in upstate New York. She was from a relatively wealthy middle-class family. She had a beautiful singing voice. She was very well educated for her time, and she was a graceful and affecting writer. And she kept a journal. She wrote letters back home throughout her time in Oregon. And those letters were published in the newspapers. And some of them were compiled into books. And she actually became sort of a window for the Protestant middle class on the East to see the American Northwest. And that was one aspect of her personality. The other aspect of her personality is that she was really ethnocentric and self-centered, and she really wasn't a very good missionary. She said as much in her own letters. And then she had the tragedy of her only child who walked into the river and drowned, a little girl when the girl was 2. And this sent Narcissa into sort of a bout of depression from which she really never recovered.
So they got to that territory in what year?
They got there in 1836.
And then 1847, you
So,
write,
yeah,
the fall of 1847, cayuses began to die in terrifying numbers.
yeah. One of the overriding themes of white presence in North America is disease.
Yeah.
And in the Pacific Northwest, disease killed between 80 and 90% of all the tribal people who lived there.
Wow.
Some of this occurred in the 1700s. Some of it occurred during the Whitman era. And the epidemics of these incurable diseases as they affected the tribal people would wax and wane. And in 1847, there was a terrible measles epidemic that came. It killed about half of the Cayuse children and maybe a third of the Cayuse adults. And the Cayuse noticed that white people would get measles and they would get sick, but they wouldn't die.
Mm-hmm.
Indians would get the measles and most of them would die. And Marcus Whitman, besides being a missionary, was also a medical doctor. And he used the special techniques, the technology of the time, which mostly consisted of bleeding people and sometimes rolling them in the snow. Mm-hmm. Which really didn't help anybody who had measles. And so the Cayuse also had a long tradition of killing failed medicine men. And it was a tradition that Marcus Whitman was very much aware of, that he had written about in his own letters. And he said that he was taking a terrible risk to continue to minister and doctor to these people because they would kill him. And he knew that he was courting this risk. In any case, in November of 1847, a few warriors in the Cayuse tribe couldn't take it anymore. So they killed Marcus, they killed Narcissa, and they killed 11 other white men. And they did it in a most brutal way. And so the true part about the Whitman massacre, as it soon became known, was that this was a tipping point in the history of the West. When word of this massacre reached Washington, about 8 months after it occurred, Congress decided to take the Pacific Northwest, which was jointly held in a treaty with Britain, and make it an official part of the United States. They declared that it was the Oregon Territory. They appointed governors, judges, and they sent an army. And all of this was triggered by the death of Marcus and Narcissa Whitman and these 11 other white people. So what Marcus Whitman's great fame, great claim to actual historic importance was that he was killed, not that he achieved anything before he was killed. And that's very important in understanding the real story of the book.
And before the measles epidemic, and before he was killed, obviously, he went east. And that's the major part of the myth of his story. What was that trip really?
Well, see, besides being a missionary who wasn't very good at converting Cayuse, in fact, the records show that he only converted 2 people in 11 years, which is not a great scorecard if you're a missionary. Besides being not very good with the Indians, he and his fellow missionaries, and by this time there were about 7 of them who'd come from New England, 7 or 8 or 9. And they did not get along at all. They constantly squabbled and tattled on each other for their Christian failings. And they were a letter-writing bunch. And they wrote more than 4,000 letters about all of their disagreements and doctrinal disputes and petty grievances. And all those letters went to Boston, where the American Board of Foreign Missionaries was based. And this is the outfit that was funding the missionaries in Oregon. And they did
have a denomination that
it was mostly Episcopalian, Presbyterian, and some Congregationalists. It's sort of a mix, but Presbyterians primarily. And so the word of the letters about the squabbling, the tattletaling, and the general misery that they were causing each other had gotten back to the boss in Boston. And the Boston boss wrote a letter to them that finally arrived in I think it was in August or September of 1842. And the letter said, "You guys are fired. We want you to stop what you're doing, and we want some of you to come home, and we want some of you to consolidate your missions." And they wanted Marcus Whitman and his wife to leave Whitman Mission. And so Marcus Whitman, who was not a real thoughtful man, not a man of contemplation, he immediately decided that he was going to get on a horse, ride to Boston, and persuade the American board that they were wrong, that they should stay. And that's what he did. On his way, he happened to stop in Washington for a few days. And we'll get to that part later. But he managed to get to Boston, and he persuaded the American board to rescind that order. And so he went then back to Oregon for another 5 years until he was killed.
Bringing with him a whole new, or encouraging a whole new group of settlers, right?
Well, actually, he didn't encourage them. He coincidentally just joined a wagon train that had already been formed.
I see.
He later claimed credit for organizing it.
Right.
And certainly in the myth of his greatness, it was claimed that he organized and brought all these Americans out. But in fact, it was he like caught a bus that was leaving anyhow, and took that wagon train back home.
You know, like so many conflicts, religious conflicts in European history and American history, there was a real tension between the Protestants and the Catholics out there, which I found fascinating. And the Catholics actually were the better people.
Well, the Catholics were much lighter on their liturgical feet than the Protestants were. They would meet with tribal people, meet with the Indians. And if the Indians were at all interested in what they were offering, they would baptize them. And all of a sudden they were Catholics.
That was it, yeah.
The Protestants would require years of hoop jumping before they could be baptized. And so, of course, the tribal people who were interested in religion for what it could do for them, a lot of them just said, well, Catholics are offering a better deal, which, of course, infuriated the Protestants.
Yep. Going back to the Cayuse, what was that trial like in the actual hanging of these?
Well, okay, so in 1847, there were maybe 10, 15 Cayuse warriors involved in this killing of 13 people. And the killing infuriated white settlers who were living mostly in the Willamette Valley, which is about 200 miles to the west of where the violence occurred, around Portland area. And that's still where most of the people in Oregon State now live. So they organized an army and went to war against the Cayuse and killed quite a few of them, and basically frightened the tribes along the Columbia River. And then this army that had been sent out by the US government after Oregon was declared a territory, it marched through Indian country around the Columbia River, and they realized that we can't fight with these people. So the Cayuse, combined with a couple other tribes, sort of rounded up the usual suspects who may or may not have been involved in the actual killing at the Whitman Mission. So they handed over 5 of them, and they became known as the Cayuse 5. And then they were transported down the Columbia River to the first formal trial, the first formal murder trial in the Pacific Northwest. And it was kind of a kangaroo court. And they were tried and rather quickly hanged.
Blaine, this book is really based on primary documents, plus the research of people from a long time ago who did their own primary research.
Right.
But what was it like for you? Where did you find those hundreds of letters and sort of uncovering the story yourself? Where did you go and what did
it
you
was
find?
it took a while to figure out where the letters were. I mean, very on in the research, I went to Yale.
The Beinecke Library?
Yeah, there are two libraries there that have some of the letters, and then Yale actually figures very prominently in the debunking of the
Yes,
legend
Bullard,
of
right,
Marcus Whitman,
right.
which we'll get to. And so, but those were the original letters, and these very fragile pieces of paper, and a lot of them also at the Harvard Library. But after I came back from Yale, I spent a lot of time at Whitman College. And it turns out that all of the letters have been transcribed and put in a digital database.
Of course, after all that work.
Yeah, and so and you know, there are more than 4,000 letters, more than 1 million words. But when you have a searchable database and you're trying to explore the chronology, you can. I spent 2 years crawling around in that database. Because I didn't know the questions to ask until I knew the questions to ask, and that was an incredible resource. And almost everybody who was a major player in this crazy story was also a very incredible letter writer. Henry Spalding, who we'll get to in a second, he wrote, you know, really hundreds of letters, but the problem with him is his handwriting was just awful. And I had some of his original letters that I could have access to, but I couldn't read them. And whoever had transcribed them could read them very well. And so it really simplified my work.
So they were transcribed into type?
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah. It's just,
fabulous.
you know, just like a newspaper.
Right.
Easy to read. Yeah,
it's amazing. You know, I mean, there are a lot of ills to the modern world, but digitizing primary documents is such a haven for all of us.
I think it would have taken me another 1.5 years to do this book without the digitization of those letters.
So we know Marcus Whitman, and he's killed, and he's taken his trip, but now the myth begins, and really the myth is the heart of your story.
Yeah, the myth and the consequences,
and the
institutions that were built on the lie. So Marcus is dead.
So start with Spalding.
Okay, Marcus is dead in 1847. 3 days after he was killed, another missionary whose name is the Reverend Henry Spalding, he approached the missionary to see what was going on there because he had a daughter who was at the mission. He had a daughter who, now we have a picture of Henry Spalding. So we'll leave that up for a while. He had a daughter who was at the mission, who was going to school under Narcissa Whitman's tutelage. She was not killed in the massacre. She was a hostage for a while. But in any case, Spalding, as he rode his horse towards the mission, he was stopped by a Catholic priest who said, "You can't go there. They want to kill you too. So what I advise you to do is to turn your horse around and run like hell back to your mission, and maybe you'll survive." Spalding, let me introduce who he was. He had come west with the Whitmans in the 1830s. He was he came from a really troubled family. His mother hadn't been married. His mother's mother hadn't been married, but he had found religion in his teens, and he ended up going to the same sort of religious school as Narcissa Whitman when they were in their early 20s. And he had fallen in love with Narcissa Whitman and proposed to her, but he was poor. He was poorly educated. He could barely read at the time. He had a bad family, and she basically told him, "No way, Jack, am I marrying you." He never forgave Narcissa Whitman. And when she married Marcus Whitman, he got mad at Marcus Whitman too. But in one of the great strange ironies of American history, they ended up serving as missionaries for the same outfit, and they went west together in 1836. The Whitmans had just been married. They were celebrating their honeymoon, and the Whitmans slept in the same tent as Spalding and his wife while they conceived their only daughter. And Spalding's mental stability was always questionable. And that probably pushed him over the edge. Later, Narcissa would write that coming west with Spalding was a terrible mistake, and that he had tormented them all their lives. So that was before the massacre. But in 1847, Spalding did turn his horse around, and he ran like hell and got away from the Cayuse, who didn't kill him. And he became sort of the oracle, the expert on what had happened at the Whitman mission, although he hadn't seen it. And so he, in the next 20 years after the killing, he made up the preposterous story that Whitman, before his death, in this visit to Washington, to the East Coast that we've mentioned, that he burst into the White House on that trip, and he persuaded the president at the time, John Tyler, that the British were coming and that they were going to take the Northwest unless the US government dispatched more white settlers. And as Spalding told the story, the president was very impressed with him, and he agreed that the Pacific Northwest must be saved from this British plot. And that's what happened. And then Whitman returned and organized a wagon train and then brought it back and saved the Pacific Northwest. That's the story that Spalding made up and sold. And this picture that you're looking at is was taken just shortly before Spalding went to Washington in 1871. This is 2 decades after the Whitman killing. But Spalding has sort of shifted from being a missionary into being a propagandist. And in this picture, he's sort of taking a picture. He had a picture taken of himself to show that he really was a sort of a magical man of God. And in the book, I wanted to just read a little annotation of this picture.
Great.
It was a stage studio photograph from the 1860s, and it captures the messianic mindset that sees Spalding in the final chapter of his long life. It depicts him as a kind of national monument, a prophet of manifest destiny, and a Merlin of the missionary arts, who was perched on the far western edge of the American experience. Tools of the preacher's trade, as he practiced it among the Nez Perce, surrounded him: a Bible cradled in his right hand, a wood-handled steel hoe firmly gripped in his left, a large woodsman axe standing beside his left leg, a draft animal's yoke resting at his feet. Behind him, hanging from the wall, is a painting of Jesus. Bristly cuttings of ponderosa pine, the evergreen tree common in the high country of eastern Oregon, are scattered at his feet. Wearing a dark waistcoat, a white shirt, a black cravat, he sits stiffly on a four-legged stool. Care has been taken to comb his hair up over his bald pate. Snarls.
He actually looks like some combination of a Old Testament prophet and a mass murderer.
Yeah. But he thought that this would be something that should show his credentials as a real far west man of God. So in 1871, he takes the train back to Washington, D.C., and he presents what's called his manifesto to the U.S. Congress. And his manifesto is basically a hodgepodge of lies about Whitman saving Oregon from the British and from Catholics and from Indians. And to his absolute delight, the Senate and the House swallow it whole, reprint it. And what's even more amazing is that this reprinting of his bogus story is then found to be a credible original primary source for other historians, who then write scores of books about how Whitman saved Oregon from the British. And those books become the standard textbooks taught in high schools all across the United States. In the Encyclopedia Britannica, in the pages of virtually every newspaper in the country, Whitman's ride to the White House is compared very favorably to other famous rides in American history. Paul Revere, among many. And Even the New York Times swallows this story and reprints it credulously a number of times.
You know, Blaine, I was stunned to read that I think as late as like 1943, the great Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas from Walla Walla bought the story. And
he did. He was raised in the story even more than I was. He grew up in Yakima, which is not far from Walla Walla, and he went to Whitman College, and he acted in a play. He played William Webster in the play, and he was sitting in the White House along with John Tyler when Whitman broke into the room and told them that the British were coming to steal Oregon. William O. Douglas, of course, then went on to go to school in Ivy League schools in the East, and he became the longest serving Supreme Court justice in American history.
But that shows how deeply ingrained it was in the history of that part of the country.
That's right. We can drop the picture of Spalding now, I think.
But long before Douglas came along, I was fascinated by the actual intense, you know, the kind of thing that you love so much, Blaine, with people going back and forth vitriolically disputing one another's arguments.
Right.
But this was like in the late 19th century, early 20th century that some people were starting to debunk it.
Right. So what happened was that the story about Whitman was, Spalding was a crazy guy in many ways, and he was very unlikable, but he also had a real populist gift. He could intuit a story. He could intuit what elements of a story would sell with the American public, particularly the Protestant church-going American public, the people who contributed to send missionaries around the world. And this was really the group of people that was running America, that's more or less always run America. So when Spalding cooked up this story, it was almost pitch perfect for what Americans wanted to hear about how the West was won. The story was simple, hero-driven, action-packed, self-congratulatory to American Christians, and it seemed to be ordained by Almighty God himself. And that's why it had such legs. And so when history books reprinted it, when it was in the New York Times, when it was circulated so broadly, it seemed natural to believe it. In fact, the story was so powerful that the college that was founded in memory of Marcus Whitman, and it was founded in the 1870s as Whitman Seminary, and then it slowly became Whitman College. By 1890, Whitman College was suffering from severe lack of funds. The faculty wasn't being paid, students weren't enrolling in the school. There was an unpayable mortgage on the two scruffy buildings on the campus in Walla Walla. And so they fired their president for incompetence, and they hired a principal character in the book, as it turns out. His name was Stephen B.L. Penrose, and he was 30 years old. He was a Penrose of Philadelphia, an eminent family. He had gone to Williams. He had a doctorate in theology from Yale, and he was working in a small town in Eastern Washington as a missionary pastor, which is a really boring job in a really small town. And so he joined the board of Whitman College so he could see more people, just at the point where the college was on its last legs. And the board looked around the room and said, who wants to be president of Whitman College? And they chose him. And he was perfect because he went to Williams. He had this elite East Coast polish, which they wanted for the school, which fancied itself as the Williams of the West. And he also would work virtually for free. He didn't have a clue how he would save the school until he went into the library one day. And this is his own autobiography tells the story. He says he walks into the library and he sees a book about Whitman saving Oregon, something he'd never heard of. But he read the book and it just struck him that, by golly, this is the way to raise money from the rest of the country because they'll love this story. They'll eat this stuff up. So he wrote a 7-page pamphlet, which was a brilliant bit of propaganda that boiled down the Whitman myth to its very essence. And the very essence of that was that Marcus Whitman was the Christ of missionaries. He died. His blood was shed so that the Pacific Northwest could be saved. So he wrote this in the pamphlet, and he then took the pamphlet on the road. And this is in 1894. Took it to Chicago, met some rich people, he met some newspaper editors, he met lots of congregational pastors, and he raised the equivalent of several $100 million at the time that rescued the school, and put it on course to becoming what it is now. Whitman College right now is probably the first or second best liberal arts college in the Northwest, and one of the best in the West. It's always been good.
Better than Gonzaga, my man?
Huh?
Better than Gonzaga?
Academically,
that's where Blaine
yes.
went.
Absolutely. It doesn't compare to Gonzaga for basketball, I'll tell you that. But academically, it's top drawer and always has been. But it would have gone broke except for this total hoax.
Right.
So Stephen D.L. Penrose took that story on the road. He traveled up and down the East Coast and gave these lectures and said, Whitman gave his blood to save the Pacific Northwest. Can't you give me a few bucks to save this little college in Walla Walla? And it worked so well.
Except for this guy in Chicago who just becomes obsessed with the fallacy of this story.
Right.
Who doggedly pursues it. He's not a historian, right? But he puts his teeth into it and goes after them.
Right. So what happens in around 1900 is that Whitman had the story of Whitman was completely accepted by the intellectual elite of the United States. New York University did a big poll, and they polled university professors, federal judges, top-ranking senators, that sort of thing. And who are the most famous, important people in American history? And at that point, Marcus Whitman ranked right up there. He was in the top drawer of explorers. He ranked above Meriwether Lewis of the Lewis and Clark expedition, incredibly, and he ranked above Sam Houston. And so the story had such broad acceptance that some people started to look at it. And the original debunker, the one who got the most publicity for it, was a professor at Yale named Edward Gaylord Bourne. And he found out about it from a University of Washington student who became a graduate student for him. In any case, Bourne went to the letters, he went to the primary sources, and he found out that Spalding had made up this story. He ended up describing Spalding as one of the most indefatigable old frauds I've ever come across in all of history.
The kind of phrase that Blaine loves.
It's true. And so the
but I thought you give more credit to Marshall.
Well, both of them, in the public eye, Bourne got more credit for it.
Yes.
But it was William Marshall, who was a principal, a high school principal in Chicago, who got obsessed with it because he had first believed in the myth, and then he'd been pretty much convinced that Spalding had made it all up. So he made it his sort of crazy mission for the rest of his life to expose the myth. And he wrote a long, incredibly boring book about the myth, but it really shattered it. And he found every document, and he worked on it, and he made scores of trips all over the country, and he shattered the myth that Whitman had saved Oregon. But what's interesting is that once particularly after the professor at Yale had told the story and said that this isn't true anymore, and he did it at a meeting of the American Historical Association, which was covered by the major newspapers at the time, the Whitman myth disappeared from the East Coast. It slowly faded away. By 1910, Whitman no longer was a household name. But in the Pacific Northwest, the myth lingered on. And I think a good way to understand what it's the same thing that happened in the South about the Civil War. There were reasons why people in the Northwest, people in the West wanted to cling to their myths about heroes. And part of it had to do with what was going on in the lives of the Native Americans who'd been consigned to the reservations. They were poor, they were victimized, their land was being stolen away by white farmers, picking at the best parts of the reservation, which was a very common experience across the West, and certainly true for the Cayuse who ended up on the Umatilla Reservation in the northeast corner of Oregon. But if you clung to a heroic story about a white missionary, then you don't really have to think about what's happening to these Indians. And that's what happened out here for another 50 years. What's in 1953, which is 53 years after the story was prominently debunked in the pages of the nation's newspapers and in the eyes of all the credible historians in the country. 53 years after that, the state of Washington, in its wisdom, chose Marcus Whitman as the most outstanding man who'd ever lived in the state, and had a statue of him made and sent to Washington to stand in the Hall of Statuary, where it's still there. It's coming out this summer, but it's still there. And so it shows the power of a lie that is so perfectly pitched to what people want to hear.
And it's coming out because? It's
coming out because just 2 weeks ago, which is marvelous, actually. 2 weeks ago, the state of Washington, the legislature and the governor of the state, they decided to replace Marcus Whitman with somebody who was actually a real life hero, and his name was Billy Frank Jr. He was a member of a tribe in Western Washington. He was arrested 50 times for fishing in rivers where he was legally entitled to fish, but where they didn't want Indians to fish, and so they kept arresting him. Wow. But finally, the law and the conscience of the state caught up with this guy's crusading mentality, and he became a hero. He died 5 or 6 years ago. So his statue is not yet made. I think they're working on it right now, but it will replace Marcus Whitman.
So we have a question from our friend Elizabeth Becker, who's also from the Northwest.
Yes.
And it is, has Whitman College responded to your book? And
yes.
You think your book will trigger questioning about it?
I've heard from, of course, to do the book, I had to spend a lot of time there and talking to faculty and students and former students. And what's interesting about Whitman College is that it honestly and thoroughly investigated its past. Historians who were professors at the school in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, they by chapter and verse, they explained that Whitman simply could not have survived if it had not peddled this myth at the turn of the 20th century. So there was no cover-up involved, but they didn't publicize this. I mean, they just did the work, published the papers, and nobody paid any real attention outside of the campus, including the students and faculty. I mean, the students were, by and large, completely unaware of who Whitman was and what he did.
They didn't get an orientation, inculcation of Whitman?
Well, they did until the 1960s, and then it stopped. So, but instead of sort of holding a press conference and saying, "Look, we really screwed up by peddling this fiction about Marcus Whitman in order to survive," they just quietly creeped away from the story. And I talked to president of the university, one of the long-serving ones, and he said that we just stopped paying any attention to Whitman and turned our attention to a more global perspective about the world. And for the university, it worked fine. But right now, I mean, just last Friday, students on the campus were demonstrating that there is to get rid of the statue of Marcus Whitman that's on the campus right now. So
What about the name itself?
That's a good question. That's been addressed by the administration, and I think it's just too much a part of the identity of the place for the name to be changed. Whitman's not the only college in America that's got a lot of
Brown, yes.
Brown, Georgetown, right there in Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
Its roots are in slavery. Mm-hmm. Yale University has lots of money that came from plantation owners. The history of the United States is very complicated, in some cases very dark. And Whitman himself did not make up this big whopper about what he did. Mm-hmm. It was in the ground when it came out. It was made up by his colleague, a man who coveted his wife. That's the story. I mean, it's not called Spalding College. Right. It's called Whitman College. So I'm not sure the name needs to be changed.
Mm-hmm. Getting back to that African fable, the book pivots around Whitman and Spalding in the myth, but at the core of it, it's also about the Native American experience.
Right.
But it's not the lion writing the history.
Right.
So, but I'm curious, Blaine, in these last minutes for you to talk about sort of your intellectual deepening and understanding of the Native American experience through the books that you've written. It's so relevant to today. In the last week, I've thought about it so much, writing my own book about Jim Thorpe, but first with Rick Santorum, the former senator, saying that Native Americans did nothing for American culture.
Right.
And David Troyer, the brilliant author of the Second Wounded Knee book, sort of saying that actually America's become more Indian rather than Indian more American.
Right, which I think is true.
Yes. Yeah. But talk about your own.
My own experience is I've written 2 books now about my home country. And the pivotal experience for that first book about the Columbia River was when I went up to another Indian reservation called the Colville Reservation, which is north of where I grew up in Moses Lake, and it's right next to Grand Coulee Dam. And Grand Coulee Dam, for those who don't know, was the biggest piece of concrete ever poured in North America. It dammed the Columbia River, and it produced all this electricity that helped win World War II. It helped make the bombs that were dropped on Nagasaki and most of the plutonium in America's nuclear arsenal. So Grand Coulee is a pivotal piece of Northwest history. My father worked there. I worked there in college until I got fired for being a snotty kid. But so in working on my book, I went up and talked to some of the people who lived on fishing before the dam was built. And I talked in particular one rainy afternoon to a guy in his 80s named Martin Louis Jr. He had been an informant. He was a tribal elder, but he was familiar in talking to white people with questions. He'd been working with anthropologists for many years, but he was old and he was angry and he was ill. And I went into his trailer. And so I told him that my dad had worked on Grand Coulee Dam, and I told him that I'd worked there, which I thought would I would sort of introduce myself as a local guy. And so he looked at me and he said, "You guys destroyed my river and you guys destroyed my people." And he said, "This is what you gave me." He got out of his bed and he went to a closet and he grabbed a can of pink salmon, government issue pink salmon, and he shoved it in my face. He says, "This is what you and your father have done to me." And all of a sudden, I wasn't. This was not a story. I was a player in this man's life as he perceived it. My whole family was. I was part of the white horde that had really wrecked his culture, and that had a big effect on me. And that was some of the reasons that I'm really interested in the effects of whites on tribal people in the Pacific Northwest. Mm-hmm. So when I started working on this book, I did not know what had happened to the Cayuse people. I thought that they were probably still on the reservation in poverty. And so I tried to talk to them. And it took a while before they would trust me enough to talk to me and to find the right people who knew the story. But after about a year, I finally could sit down with 3 or 4 of the elders who knew the whole history of the tribe and the recent history of the tribe.
Are they in the same place, or were they moved at all? Or
no, that was, in fact, one of the keys to the survival of tribes in the West is the Indian treaties that gave them a piece of land that could not be taken away from them. The treaties were, ratified by the U.S. Senate. They were violated, encroached upon, but around the 1960s, federal courts, federal judges started to read literally the language in those treaties, and the rights and the privileges that were spelled out in the treaties became rights and privileges that they could enforce. So
in the 60s, but before that, they'd lost millions and millions of acres.
Yeah, there was for the Cayuse, the people on the Umatilla Reservation, they had like at least 130 years in the wilderness of diminishing population, poverty, crippling alcoholism, Indian schools that took away the kids and brought them back as sort of half inculcated into white culture, half brought up to be tribal people, and widely confused. Lots of people left. The population of the reservation shrunk. So they describe it itself as the reservation was in a terrible state in the 60s and 70s. But what happened in the past 30 years is something I didn't know, but I've discovered, and it actually makes for a really happy ending to the book. What happened was some people went out to cities like San Francisco, got educated, and then came back. And Richard Nixon, of all people, was a person who decided that the reservations deserved to have their legal rights enforced, and for the federal government to pay for social services and education to help people manage their own affairs properly. And the generation of people who revived the reservation were beneficiaries of that. So they became lawyers, fish biologists, land use planners, construction engineers. They learned how to use the white man's law and the tax advantages that living on a reservation gave them to their own advantage. And then the big casino came in the 1990s, the Indian Gaming Act, which allowed them to put up a first-class casino inside the reservation. And it drew people from Portland, a couple hundred miles away, from Spokane, from Idaho. And all of a sudden they had $5, $10, $15 million a year in real cash for a reservation of 4,000 to 6,000 people. And they started to invest that money in new businesses, in agriculture, the stock market, and they've done really well. And they've improved life expectancy, medical care, smoking rates have gone down, obesity rates have gone down. It's really quite an amazingly successful story, and lots of kids are going to college and then coming back with even more sophisticated skills. And that is the end point of the story. The story that the guys who lived this whole story are now in their 80s. And what they told me, what they like to do now, I mean, they retired from tribal government, and what they do is they basically go to lunch. What they do is they like to go to lunch at the casino.
Sounds like us.
Yeah. They go to lunch at the casino, they get a Coke, they get a sandwich, and they watch white people lose money. And they say it's the best thing they ever saw.
That's great. One last thing, Blaine, another question or statement, which I think you'll appreciate. It's from Amy Shapiro, who lives in Oregon. This is fascinating. I'm in Oregon right now, working to change some of the words in the Oregon state song. Our bill passed the Oregon House, and today I made our case to the Senate Rules Committee. My question is, do you think that the words "blessed by the blood of martyrs" in the state song refers to the Whitmans?
Oh, almost certainly. almost certainly. This blood of Marcus Whitman business, it was everywhere. It was everywhere. It was just, everybody loved to invoke it because it had all this Christian imagery that rang bells for people, I'm sure.
So the statues coming out of Statuary Hall and out of the Oregon State Song.
Yeah.
That's great. Blaine, thanks so much. I've really loved talking with you today.
This is great, David.
And the book, everybody, is terrific.
Well, thank you both so much. A big thank you to our speakers and for everyone out there for joining us this evening. Your patronage is what enables us to bring you programming like this. And we cannot continue to host great events like this without the book sales to support them. Please support Blaine Harden and Politics and Prose Bookstore by using the link in the chat to purchase Murder at the Mission. Please also visit our website for the most up-to-date event listings. We hope to see you at an event soon. In the meantime, stay well, everyone, and stay well.